Today, I'll talk to the first U.S. official known to resign in protest over the Afghan war. Don't miss this conversation with a real hero. I'd like to welcome Matthew Hoh to Off the Grid. Matthew served 2 tours of duty with the United States Marines in Iraq in 2009. He worked for the State Department and served as a senior civilian representative in Afghanistan. 5 months into his contract, Matthew resigned, stating, quote, "I have lost understanding and of confidence in the strategic purposes of the United States' presence in Afghanistan." A true patriot. First of all, Matthew, let me say to you, Semper Fi.
Hey, thank you, Governor. It's good to be on. Thank you.
Matthew, when you were in the Marine Corps now, you were an officer?
I was a combat engineer officer.
Okay, and what rank did you finally achieve? What did you get out as?
Captain.
Is this war worth it? Has it been worth it?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. The price we paid on 9/11 was tragic, was horrible, but our response has been so disproportionate. It's been so counterproductive. We've invaded 2 countries that had nothing to do with 9/11. And the result has just been 7,000 American dead, 50,000 wounded. 2 Iraq and Afghan vets kill themselves every day. And then the consequences overseas have been horrible. In Iraq, we're looking upwards of maybe 500,000 people killed since 2003. The violence is ongoing. Similar type of violence in Afghanistan with no end in sight to that. So no, it has not been worth it. We blindly charged into these conflicts, played right into Al-Qaeda's hands, and 13 years later, we're still in the midst of it.
So really what you're saying, we're doing exactly what bin Laden and the terrorist Al-Qaeda group wanted us to do, right? We're playing the game according to the way they expected us to do it, right?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, and bin Laden even said such, and he said it a number of times. And, my favorite bin Laden quote, if I can have a favorite, but he says, all you need to do is send 2 mujahideen to the farthest point east with the black flag of jihad, and the American generals will come running, and they will exhaust themselves diplomatically, economically, and morally. And that's exactly what we've done.
And so we're falling into the very trap of the guy who allegedly attacked us, and we're doing exactly what they want. Why, Matthew, do you think we're doing that?
I think it's hubris. I think it's revenge, it's fear. I think a lot of it has to do that, it's cliche, but when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and it's true. We spend half our discretionary money in this country in terms of federal government spending on defense. We spend almost $1 trillion a year, all told, when you lump in all our national security things, whether it be veterans programs or State Department or Homeland Security or just interest on the debt from these wars. And I think that becomes a problem. And that has focused us into only having the only solution being military efforts, which with this problem with Al-Qaeda, on 9/11, Al-Qaeda was only 200 people strong. And so you can't go to war against an organization of only 200 people. And by doing so, and then by invading Iraq, we played right into their propaganda. We fed right into their narrative. The biggest recruitment for Al-Qaeda this last decade was not the 9/11 attacks. It was the photos from Abu Ghraib. It was the photos from Guantanamo Bay. It was the invasion of Iraq. So yes, absolutely, we've fallen right into this trap. And there's really no reasons for it other than stupidity and a lack of creative thought and intellectual honesty on our part.
Matthew, do you think it might be we want to? We got to feed the military-industrial complex here in this country. We all know that by the defense dollars we spend when we do a budget. Do you think that we're creating terrorists on purpose so that we can continually perpetuate this war on terror, and like George Bush said, it'll last decades and decades? I'm getting that feeling that we're doing this stuff on purpose to create terrorists so we have someone to fight.
I I think you give our folks too much credit there in Washington, D.C., Governor, to have put this together as some sort of plan. Whenever I think of these things, whenever I talk about my time in the government, I say, look, give yourself two vertical axes, one incompetence and one conspiracy. And almost everything the American government does falls down next to incompetence. I think what you have, though, is you have this Leviathan, you have this $1 trillion defense industrial complex that while they're not saying we're going to create terrorists as a direct consequence, everything they're doing, second and third order effects are. So I think we've accidentally created this perpetual war because we wanted to feed this massive bureaucracy, this $1 trillion a year industry, and that's the outcome. I don't think there was a cabal of people that sat together, and created this monster. But I think it's a Frankenstein that was created by our own foreign policy, our own need to be an empire, and by our own continual feeding of, again, this $1 trillion Leviathan.
Do you think Iraq was better off with Saddam Hussein, or are they better off today with ISIS running around? Because I'm under the opinion that if Saddam were still in power, there wouldn't be ISIS in Iraq. Is that true?
Yeah, no, there would not be. And certainly all the Iraqis I know, and I spent time in Kurdistan, and I certainly met the Kurds would come up to you and they'd thank you for getting rid of Saddam. But by that point in 2004, they were the only ones thanking us, and so I think the Kurds are happy with the status quo as it is now because they've actually been able to enlarge their territory. They've actually been able to gain more oil fields over these last few months with the collapse of the Iraqi army in the north. But for the rest of Iraqis, no, absolutely not. My friends that are Iraqi, the ones that I'm still able to be in contact with, because so many have been killed and so many just can't be in contact with them anymore. No, it's not better off. And I think if you remember, the most poignant story I've heard about this was, do you remember in 2003 when American Marines went into Baghdad and they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Furrow Square? It was on CNN, and everybody around the world watched. And at one point, this big Iraqi bodybuilder came out of the crowd and he started whacking the statue with a sledgehammer. And it was very emotional.
Yeah, I remember it.
Right? Well, and I forget, I think it was Vanity Fair, they spoke to him several years ago and he said, no, it wasn't worth it. I've had 8 members of my family killed. The catastrophe that we've caused, our hubris, our thinking that we can control war, that somehow the principles of war, the madness of war, and also too that these people who are supposedly on our side, again, we align ourselves with the most corrupt people possible in these countries, and then we act shocked when these insurgencies spring up against them.
From the start of this, all you heard was about this isn't Vietnam, and I don't expect you, Matthew, to comment on Vietnam, but I will. I think it's identical in many ways to Vietnam. I think both of these wars, you don't know who your friends are, you don't know who your enemies are, and I think they're very much like the Vietnam that we're involved now in another Vietnam that we had during my generation when I was young. Now we got a whole new generations going through their own Vietnams. You concur with that?
Absolutely, and I made that a point to myself to ask you about that because I know you've seen the same things. You hear, just to talk about, you hear now as we need to go back to our war in Iraq, we need to go to war in Syria, you hear these commentators from Washington, D.C., or these politicians talking about how we have to align ourselves with moderate forces. And I don't know about you, Governor, but did you see any moderation in war? I mean, I certainly never did. Back in Afghanistan, there's no such moderation before. So it bothers me. I know it must bother you to hear these people on television talking about this with no context, no clue of what the actual practice of war is like. And somehow, again, we haven't learned anything after decades of this.
You recently wrote an article about ISIS and you said, quote, "The beheadings are bait. When it comes to Iraq, our government has taken the bait before, haven't we?" Please explain that to the listeners. The beheadings are bait.
Sure, and what I was referring to in 2004, when we had already invaded Iraq, so we had already opened that door, we'd already unleashed that catastrophe, but we made it worse. This is the point where there was no turning back from the horrors that was going to occur in Iraq. In spring of 2004, 4 American contractors, security contractors from Blackwater, were ambushed and mutilated, immolated, and strung up in Fallujah. That video and those photographs went viral around the world. About a month later, a young American named Nicholas Berg, who had traveled to Iraq to find work, was captured and then beheaded. And same thing, that video went live. It went viral all across international television as well as across the internet. The response in the U.S. was outrage, it was shock, it was fear, and the Bush administration felt like they had to do something to show that Operation Iraqi Freedom was not falling apart, that all we need was to be decisive and assertive, and we put an end to this. Well, we invaded Fallujah for the first time. We pushed our troops deeper into cities. We really went on the quote-unquote offensive against terrorists, which really meant we just persecuted the Sunnis, and it was a complete boon to the insurgency because we played right into Al-Qaeda's hands. We played right into the insurgents' hands. Our troops were imprisoning people. We were killing people who had nothing to do with the insurgency. And we basically, the insurgency that already existed, it sprung into life. At the same point, too, politically, we made a huge mistake because we wanted to wash our hands and let Iraq be sovereign. And that's what we did. And actually, remember, Paul Bremer, who ran the occupation authority in Baghdad, left 2 days early. He actually ran out of Baghdad 2 days early and handed over the government back to Iraq. And there was nothing in place. There was no security forces. There was no political system in place. So then you create this political vacuum, and the result was this chaos. You had this insurgency that was motivated because our troops were acting even more aggressive than normally were. And then you had this political vacuum, and the result is now, hey, 10 years later, here we are. And so with ISIS, with the Islamic State, they're a parasite. They need chaos. They need violence. They need the Sunnis to be afraid. They need the Sunnis to feel like the only chance we have is to align ourselves with the Islamic State. People talk about the Sunnis as if they don't know that the Islamic State are full of psychopaths and killers. They do, and they're aligning with them in spite of that, because for the last 11 years, they've been persecuted. In particular, the last 4 years under the Baghdad government, they've been imprisoned, they've been disappeared, they've been shut out of revenue, they've been shut out of governance. Security forces have basically been very repressive towards the Sunnis. So now you have the situation where if we come rushing in, if we come back in to avenge Foley and Sotloff, and I'm not saying what happened to them, the perpetrators should not be held accountable and justice should not be served. But if we come rushing in there, hell-bent on revenge, all we're going to do is exacerbate the crisis. And you can see this happening right now. Reuters had a story today about how, exactly like a lot of us are afraid of, you go in there on the side of the Shia and the Kurds, you're just going to help the Shia and the Kurds persecute the Sunnis, and you're just going to make this conflict even worse. You're just going to stir it up even more.
You know, on that note, I'll hit you with this. From Senators Dianne Feinstein, who's on the left, to Ted Cruz on the right, lots of politicians are banging the war drums again. What's your response to those two, Feinstein and Cruz, who are saying we need to go back to war in there?
Well, I think politicians like them, Cruz hasn't been in office very long, but I wish they'd be held accountable for their previous mistakes. I think it's a joke. I think, and I'm sure you agree with me, Governor, Buck McKeon, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, said yesterday or today he doesn't think the Congress has time to vote on going to war in Iraq. And you see all the leaders, both sides of both parties in Congress, don't want to have a vote on going back to war in Iraq. They all want to make statements, but it doesn't seem like many of them want to be held accountable. And that type of cowardice and that type of political theater is, very symptomatic of the overall problems we have in this country. I mean, the perpetual wars we're having overseas is just one element of issues we have across the country that stems from very, very deficient and very, very cowardly leadership coming out of Washington, D.C. by both parties.
What would happen if we just pulled out of the Middle East, closed down our damn embassies and all that, and just said, hey, you're on your own, we're done with this nonsense? Is that at all feasible?
I don't think you'd have much of a worse outcome than if we stay there ineptly meddling. I mean, my whole life, I was born in '73, and we've had nothing but a military first policy towards the Middle East. I only did 10 years in the Marines, right? But friends of mine who've done 25 and 30 years, they spent over half or 2/3 of their time in the military in the Middle East, and it hasn't gotten any better. It has only gotten worse. Each year it gets worse and worse. So I think if we were to pull out, yes, you're going to have violence. You're going to have some corrupt crooked regimes fall, but I think you would take away, one, our net meddling, the United States coming in there trying and picking and choosing sides. And secondly, you would take away a lot of this notion of the crusade still going on that feeds these extreme terrorist groups. I mean, these extreme terrorist groups, they have a narrative that they're following. We're playing right into it. What I say a lot of times, Governor, is like, look, if we develop alternative energy sources, if we use the own energy we have in this country, and we ignore the Middle East, then we can start treating the Middle East like we treat Africa and ignore it. I mean, so we have to just develop our own alternative energy sources, develop our own abilities to stop meddling, and let the Middle East go its own way. And at some point then maybe re-engage as a neutral arbiter who actually has some kind of stability and peace behind its purposes, as opposed to now where we just try and pick and choose winners and losers because these folks in Washington, D.C. are playing some type of game of risk, basically.
With the technology we have today, why do we need bases in 178 countries, and why do we continue to meddle in other people's affairs?
We have 800, 1,000 bases around the world, depending on how you look at it. And what blows my mind, and I'm sure it blows your mind too, Governor, and your listeners, is that what's the first thing that happens when something like Iraq pops up again? The Pentagon asks for more money. The Pentagon gets about $600 billion a year, but every time something occurs, they have to ask for more money. I mean, so the whole thing it's a business, it's a racket, it's where our priorities are. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at from the Key Bridge in Rosslyn, Virginia, down to Reagan National Airport in Crystal City, that whole expanse there is all one big national defense complex. It's one huge Pentagon reservation. And the hundreds of thousands of people that work for that and all the money that goes into that. And can you imagine if we had our priorities someplace else? But we're so obsessed with keeping this empire. We're so obsessed with this romantic vision of war. We're so obsessed with this nonsense notion that everybody except for, white Anglo-Saxon Americans subscribes to of American exceptionalism. We're so obsessed with it that it guides our policy, and it's leading us into, it's leading us into destruction, basically.
We'll bring it to a close on this, Matthew. I've said it before. We're following the diagram of the Roman Empire to a T. It's like they laid it out for us, the Roman Empire, and we're following it. Matthew, I want to thank you for coming on and having the courage, Matthew Hoh, for being here today and for taking a principled stand against our country's flawed foreign policy in Afghanistan and Iraq. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for your service, and thank you for speaking the truth after. And remember, for all my listeners, stay vigilant. There's people like Matthew Hoh out there who are willing to walk the line for you. We got to back them up.
Wounded. 2 Iraq and Afghan vets kill themselves every day. And then the consequences overseas have been horrible. In Iraq, we're looking upwards of maybe 500,000 people killed since 2003. The violence is ongoing. Similar type of violence in Afghanistan with no end in sight to that. So, no, it has not been worse.
Stand. A true patriot. First of all, Matthew, let me say to you, Semper Fi.
Hey, thank you, Governor. It's good to be on. Thank you.
Matthew, when you were in the Marine Corps now, you were an officer?
I was a combat engineer officer.
Okay, and what rank did you finally achieve? What did you get out as?
Captain.
Is this war worth it? Has it been worth it?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't.
Today, I'll talk to the first U.S. official known to resign in protest over the Afghan war. Don't miss this conversation with a real hero. I'd like to welcome Matthew Hoh to Off the Grid. Matthew served 2 tours of duty with the United States Marines in Iraq in 2009. He worked for the State Department and served as a senior civilian representative in Afghanistan. 5 months into his contract, Matthew resigns, stating, quote, "I have lost understanding and of confidence in the strategic purposes of the United States presence in Afghanistan."
You know, the price we paid on 9/11 was tragic, was horrible, but our response has been so disproportionate. It's been so counterproductive. We've gotten into we've invaded two countries that really had nothing to do with 9/11. You know, and the result has just been, 7,000 American dead, 50